Welcome to Ray-ality TV. I'm Raymond Bakari. Over a dozen candidates have announced that they are running to replace outgoing Congressman David Cicilline in this year's special election, with the primary being set for September 5th and the general election being set for November 7th. One of those candidates running in the special election for the Democratic primary is Nick Autiello. Nick, how are you today?
I'm great, Raymond. How are you?
I'm doing great, and thank you for coming on. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you for
First,
having me.
absolutely. First question, why do you want to represent Rhode Island in Congress?
It's a great question. As we are facing so many crises in this country and in our state right now, I really of leadership in Washington to tackle the cost of living crisis that families are under right now, to tackle climate change and build a better future for our kids, to save our democracy and rebuild our democracy to be able to protect our people over the next century, and for the United States to be able to compete on the world stage in another century, and to fight back against the attacks that are coming from the far right on abortion care, on guns, on the LGBTQ community, on women, on people of color, and to finally say enough is enough.
And there are so many candidates running in this primary too that are likely going to agree with you on some of those policy positions. It seems like the list is growing day to day. I'm surprised no one announced that they were running today. Some of those who are watching may know that you ran for state senate in 2018 or that you were in Governor Raimondo's Commerce Department. But what differentiates you from your opponents in this primary?
I think it's my story. I grew up in Rhode Island, and when I was growing up, I watched firsthand how hollow the middle class has become in this country and how hard it is for working families to make it in this country now. Both of my grandfathers owned small businesses in Providence. Today, both of those small businesses are now the same chain dollar store. And when I was growing up, my dad owned a jewelry store that right before the recession started to lose its ability to support our family. And we were forced to uproot our lives. And we ended up moving to Florida when I was in high school at LaSalle Academy. And it was just so disruptive. And I saw firsthand how fragile our economy actually is. Even when you have a great middle class family and everything is going, you can put food on the table, you can pay the bills at the end of the month, but how quickly it can just all be ripped away. And so that was my formative experience. And that's why I dedicated my life to making sure that no kid growing up in Rhode Island was going to have that same kind of a problem growing up. That's why when I worked in Governor Raimondo's office, part of my portfolio was rebuilding our state's economy, investing in manufacturing, in innovation, in research and development, in bringing good new jobs to the state. And then when I worked in the private sector, I worked on climate change, but I was able to do it from Rhode Island. And have this really great, interesting global job that I was able to do from Rhode Island. And it made a huge difference. And I really believe that I'm the only candidate in the race who has worked at the highest levels of government in Rhode Island and in the private sector around the world, who's tackled some of these big challenges and built coalitions to solve big problems. And I think that's exactly what we need in our new member of Congress.
Now, looking at some of the policies that new member of Congress may end up focusing on if elected, one of them is addressing gun violence. That's a top priority on voters' minds throughout the country, but especially in this Democratic primary. There are multiple avenues that can be taken when considering this policy goal. Which specific measures would you support?
I would support many. I think high on the priority list needs to be an assault weapons ban. We had this in this country and it worked, and then we got rid of it, and gun violence went up. It's just so basic, and you just watch what has happened just in the last week, 10 days of more and more senseless, violent death of kids in this country, and we have to accept that we need a Democratic Party that is going to push for this to happen as soon as we get control back. And I do believe that we will get control of the House back fairly soon. But once we got to the point where kids could die in a school shooting or just for knocking on the wrong door, and the Republican Party is not able to find it in themselves to do anything, this is unfortunately not an area where we're going to find compromise. We are just going to have to finally pass strong gun laws in this country, admit that the Second Amendment has been interpreted wrongly by the court, and that is a recent development in our country's history over the last 200 years, and finally take back control of what guns mean in this country.
Some of those points that you mentioned toward the end of that answer, you'll likely hear the pushback from the 2A crowd, and it is a Republican-controlled House. So in that meantime, say for example, you get elected, and then it's still a Republican House even after 2024. How
Yeah.
would you plan to try to respond to that 2A crowd and possibly even convince some Republicans to come on your side of
It's a
the
good
issue?
question. I think, look, you talk to anyone, and I have some fairly right-wing family members, as I'm sure many of us do. Most people get the very basic stuff around this, that you should have a background check to be able to get a gun. That shouldn't be partisan. That if you have a history of mental health issues that have put you in a place where you shouldn't have a gun, it should be harder or impossible for you to get a gun. And these are things that most people agree on, but Congress has been so corrupted, and specifically the House Republican Party has been so corrupted by the addiction to money from the gun lobby that they have, that it is just impossible for them to even come to the table for some of these things that 80% of the country agrees on. And forget about some of the more controversial things that I think we need to do. And so we've just got to push back against that and make it so hard for House Republicans to maintain the position that they have on these issues because of the money that they are just sucking in from the NRA and the gun lobby.
For that part where you mentioned some of the controversial things, is there any other measures you would support alongside the assault weapons ban then?
I think the assault weapons ban is where we have to start. I think we also need to really look at the bigger picture in our society. I don't know this, and I don't think this is personally controversial. I think guns are a huge part of the problem. There's no question. There is absolutely no question. But you look, and especially some of these deaths have really hit me from the last week of, kid knocks on the wrong door. It's just, it drives me completely nuts. There's something deeper in our society that is broken, that the guns are making it very easy for people to react to. But there's a fundamental lack of trust in our society that has developed over the last 30 or 40 years. And people don't trust their neighbors. People certainly don't trust their government. They don't trust certain corporations. But they don't even trust their neighbors anymore. They have such a lack of connection to their communities. And that's where you're seeing people act out. And we have to take guns away from people who are prone to act out. There are too many guns in this country, but we also have to address this crisis of meaning and belonging that we are facing in this country that is, I think, driving quite a bit of the problems, not just in terms of gun violence, but a lot of problems that we're seeing in our society today.
Moving on to the environment, because that's also another big policy
Yes.
goal that's going to be focused on in this primary, and a lot of the candidates are going to be asked to present their plans when it comes to this topic. This might be a bit of a loaded question, but legislatively, how would you want the policy goal of protecting the environment to look like? Are we talking Green New Deal?
Yeah, so I'm a supporter of the Green New Deal resolution in the House. I think that is an amazing starting point. I think for me, I approach climate change and the environment not from the position of all we have to do is blame the actors who got us to where we are. And there is a lot of blame to go around for sure. But for me, I want to look forward as to how we solve the problem and what opportunity there is for Rhode Islanders in solving the problem. You walk around a huge part of the 1st Congressional District, in 20, 30 years, it's going to be underwater. And we're not just talking like rich people's houses on the coast. We're talking a lot of working class families whose homes are very close to the water in Rhode Island. This is a huge problem for these families' ability to own a home, to be able to sell that home when they retire and have a healthy retirement. This is a huge problem for small businesses that are in low-lying areas. It's a huge problem, but there is so much opportunity in solving it. If we get it right, we can stem the level of sea level rise that we'll be facing in Rhode Island and create thousands of great jobs in Rhode Island and millions of jobs around the country. And I'm excited because I think these jobs will have a huge amount of meaning to people. You think back to the Great Depression and all of the programs from the original New Deal and how much meaning was in the jobs that people were given and that were created at that time to rebuild the country. And I really think that as we rebuild a world from COVID and the climate destruction that we are seeing every day, there is so much opportunity for people at all levels of the education spectrum, at jobs, in all parts of our economy to contribute to this solution, which for me, is the defining issue of our century and our generation. This is the war that we have to win.
Oftentimes, when discussing this issue, you'll hear a lot of opposition from the right.
Yep.
One of them, I'll do it in two parts. So the first one, typically they'll bring up is the cost of the Green New Deal. Figures I've heard is that it would cost in the trillions. What would your response be when they say, "How do we pay for it?"
If we don't do anything, the cost of letting climate change go forward unabated will make whatever it takes to invest in the solution look like pennies. I mean, when you look at the amount of destruction that is on its way over the next couple of decades, the cost of doing nothing is astronomically high.
The other part of it that they'll bring up is, especially occasionally, you'll see the headlines where they say, "Oh, the gas stoves are being taken away from us," or that they want electric vehicles to be forced upon everybody, or they don't want anybody to eat any more meat, or that the farmland's being bought by the wealthy billionaires. So, what would your overall response to those be? Like, is there a line that has to be drawn when it comes to this conversation about the protecting the environment?
We have to think about where those attitudes are coming from. And I think people have legitimate concerns about a massive transition in every area of our economy and our daily lives. And to not address those concerns would be wrong and silly from a point of strategy from those of us who want to see that transition occur. On the other hand, these are messages that are being pushed through our system by the forces that don't want anything to change, by the big oil companies who don't want anything to change quickly, by those who are making a lot of money off the system as it is, to convince people that there is this big, scary movement trying to force them into a new way of life, when in reality, if we get this all right, we're going to have a better world for everyone to live in, for our kids to live in, for cleaner air, cleaner water. The lower cost, ultimately, electric vehicles are going to be a lower cost option during this transition. And ultimately, I think people will see that and they will move to them on their own. We just have to invest right now to make sure that the transition happens as quickly as possible to avoid the worst effects of climate change. I really believe that we will get to this zero carbon future at some point. The question that is up for debate right now that we have to answer is, will that point be before we have avoided the worst effects of climate change? And we have to do everything in our power to ensure that we absolutely avoid the worst effects of climate change.
Before I move on from this, is it going to get to that point, though, where we're not going to be able to eat meat anymore? Because I've been hearing that one a lot.
I think there is so much technology coming out right now that I think that is just a bogeyman that the far right has injected into the conversation. No one is taking anyone's ability to eat meat away. That there are ways to farm responsibly. There are so many ways that this will be possible. Should people reduce the amount of meat that they consume? I think so. I personally have. I haven't eliminated meat from my diet entirely, but I have tried to reduce it. But there is a lot to this transition. And we have to remember that this is a global systemic issue. And when we talk about these kind of scary things of, oh, don't eat meat, you won't be able to go on vacation anymore and fly on planes, you can't do that. We have to remember that emissions that are causing this problem come from so many areas, and so many of them are not talked about. We talk about electric vehicles, and that's great. We need to talk a lot about electric vehicles. We talk about electrifying the grid. That's great. We need to do that. We absolutely have to do that. But you talk about a lot of heavy industry on this planet. That is a huge emitting thing that is not going to be solved by electrifying a grid, because of how much energy it takes to go into some of these factories. And by the way, these factories are all over the world. They're not just in the United States. We're talking about emissions that we have moved away from the United States, that Europe has moved away from Europe into Asia and parts of India. And these are emissions that take so much energy that we've got to find new solutions. And those are the things where I think it would be more helpful to move the conversation too, instead of some of these scary things that aren't going to happen, like banning meat. Like, that's not going to happen.
Sometimes I also hear, and before I do move on to the next one, because I really do want to ask you this since it just popped up in my head. Nuclear energy, where do you stand on that?
Yes. Look, I think I personally think we have made a huge mistake in moving nuclear energy off the agenda for the last several decades. And I understand why we did. I absolutely understand the fear that is in a lot of people over the accidents that have happened in the past. At the end of the day, nuclear technology is clean energy. And we have to absolutely have it as part of the mix. What I'm really excited about is some of the developments that are happening in the fusion space, which is kind of the other side of the nuclear coin, which are these smaller scale reactors that can power a neighborhood. This technology is still probably 50 years away, and we have to deal with the problem right now of emissions. This is not a silver bullet at all. But if we look 50 years down the road, you can see a whole economy powered by nuclear fusion that is really exciting, extremely clean, extremely local, and really gets at the affordability, the security, and the reliability of energy that people really depend upon.
Looking at term limits now, especially, it's relevant to talk about in this special election, and even just in Rhode Island in general, because both of our Congress people, Congressman Langevin and Congressman Cicilline, did serve quite a bit of time in Congress, and our senior senator has been in D.C. for quite a bit of time as well. Where do you stand on term limits?
So I share the frustration I think many people in my generation and other generations share about people who get into office and overstay their welcome. And I think we're seeing this play out in California right now, right in front of our eyes. I think we do have to think very carefully about term limits and not have a knee-jerk reaction to the problem. I think the other side of the coin is when you have people cycling in and out of government too quickly, the lobbyists take over, because you as a member of Congress, or even in Rhode Island as a member of the House or the Senate, aren't able to develop the knowledge of the process and the knowledge of the policies that you need to have to be an effective legislator. And something is going to fill that void. And typically that something will be lobbyists and their money. So I am more in favor of an age cap on service in government. This has worked in the Catholic Church for thousands of years just fine. But I do think that it is important that we have members who are able to build the experience and knowledge that it takes, because it is a very unique job to be an effective member for while they're in Washington. I think David Cicilline has done this fantastically. He served us fantastically well for 12 years and is hanging up his hat, having felt like he's accomplished what he's able to accomplish and that there's something next for him in his journey. That's the kind of member of Congress I hope that I would be.
So it sounds like you're not too favor of term limits from what I'm hearing, but an age cap instead?
I think it's an issue we have to deal with. I am not in favor of term limits in the way that they are typically talked about. I think people say, 8 or 10 years, or that's not really enough. It's a little arbitrary. And frankly, elections should be the term limits, really. What we have to do is fix the campaign finance problem in this country so that incumbents are not so protected at every turn that people who really do feel they want to change in their representation have a real shot at making that change. What we have right now is a system where almost always an incumbent is guaranteed to win their reelection. And really, it should be up to the people. Look, if people want to keep sending someone back to Congress genuinely, that's democracy. That is the right that they should have.
I have a couple of lightning round questions I want to ask to get through some topics quickly. 1 to 2 word, one sentence at the most. Do you support or oppose statehood for Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico?
I personally support statehood for both of them. I think those things should absolutely be up to the people in Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico, but I personally do support them.
Banning members of Congress from trading stocks, would you support or oppose that?
100% support.
And I didn't have this one written, but I want to ask, if it doesn't pass in the time that you're in Congress, would you commit to not partaking in any stock trading?
Absolutely. If
elected, who is one congressperson that you would look forward to working with?
You're already trying to get me in trouble with my future colleagues by picking one. I really admire Congressman Ro Khanna from California, and I'm really looking forward to working with him. I think the way that he's been able to talk about jobs and the future of our country and what they mean for people is really, really important. And I'm looking forward to working with him.
Lastly, for the lightning round section, President Biden is going to be running for re-election. It was reported that he's going to announce this coming week. He already has two primary opponents, though, and I want to ask you this specifically because in 2020 you were an economic and foreign policy advisor for Pete Buttigieg, one
Yep.
of Biden's opponents. Do you plan to support Biden in 2024?
As the field stands now, yes, I do.
The last question is non-political and not lightning round. We're off that now, but I like to ask this one at the end just to keep things away from politics. In your opinion, what do you think Rhode Island is best known for?
Food, our food. We are so lucky that we have so much variety of food that reflects how amazing and diverse and interesting our state is. So absolutely our food.
Very, very true. In my neck of the woods in Providence, Federal Hill is the best place to go. Do you have any CD1 spots that you've been hitting on the campaign trail so far?
I have been imbibing a huge amount of Portuguese food over the last few weeks, which I am extremely excited to continue doing.
Awesome. Well, that's all the questions I had. Nick, I want to thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure of mine to have you on.
Thanks for having me, Ryan.
Absolutely. And thank you for watching this episode of Ray-ality TV. If you want to see future episodes as soon as they're posted on this channel, please click the subscribe button down below and the post notification bell icon to the right of it. I'm Raymond Bakari. I'll see you next time.